They found her curled in the corner of the concrete cell, broken and shattered like a discarded doll. For 3 days, the interrogators at Steelwater Detention Center had assumed they were dealing with a captured enemy combatant who'd been tortured beyond recovery. But when the medical examiner discovered 4 small words tattooed behind her left shoulder blade, everything they thought they knew about warfare, pain, and human endurance was about to be turned completely upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Colorado mountains stretched endlessly in every direction from Steelwater Detention Center, their snow-capped peaks creating a natural fortress around one of the most secure interrogation facilities in the United States. Built into the side of a granite cliff face, the facility was invisible to satellite surveillance and accessible only through a single mountain road that wound treacherously through terrain that had claimed more than a few vehicles over the years. It was the kind of place where the government sent problems that needed to disappear quietly. High-value targets whose capture couldn't be acknowledged. Enemies of the state whose existence was too sensitive for regular military prisons. The kind of facility that officially didn't exist on any government database. Funded through black budgets and staffed by personnel whose service records were classified at levels most people couldn't even access. Dr. Oliver Kane had been the chief medical officer at Steelwater for 6 years, and in that time, he'd seen things that would haunt lesser men for the rest of their lives. Prisoners who'd been broken by torture techniques that pushed the boundaries of international law. Enemy operatives who'd been subjected to psychological warfare that left them as empty shells of their former selves. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to treat each case as a medical puzzle rather than a human tragedy, because the alternative was madness. But the woman they'd brought in 3 days ago was different. Not just different, impossible. She'd been discovered during a raid on a suspected terrorist cell operating out of an abandoned warehouse in Detroit. Intelligence had suggested the cell was planning something significant, something that could threaten national security. When the tactical team breached the building, they'd expected to find bomb-making materials, communications equipment, maybe a handful of low-level operatives they could flip for information. Instead, they'd found a torture chamber that looked like something from medieval times. Chains hanging from concrete walls, tables stained with substances that forensics teams were still analyzing. And in the center of it all, a woman who appeared to have been subjected to torments that should have killed her days earlier. The tactical team leader, Sergeant Marcus Torres, had radioed for immediate medical evacuation. He'd seen combat in 3 different theaters of operation, had pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles and carried dying comrades through hostile territory. But the woman in that warehouse had shaken him in ways he couldn't explain. She was just lying there. He'd reported later, his voice still carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed. Conscious, but not really there, you know? Like someone had taken everything that made her human and just erased it. The transport to Steelwater had been arranged within hours. Standard protocol for anyone discovered in circumstances that suggested enemy involvement. She carried no identification, spoke no words, and showed no reaction to questions in multiple languages. Her fingerprints weren't in any database. Her DNA matched no known profiles. For all practical purposes, she didn't exist. Agent Samantha Frost had been called in to handle the interrogation. At 34, she was one of the most skilled interrogators in the intelligence community, with a reputation for breaking subjects who'd resisted every other technique. She'd extracted information from hardened terrorists, foreign spies, and domestic extremists who'd been trained to resist conventional interrogation methods. But when she'd first seen the woman they were calling Subject 7 Alpha, something had felt wrong. The prisoner sat in the corner of cell block C, chamber 9, her knees drawn up to her chest, arms wrapped around her legs in a protective posture that spoke of trauma beyond imagination. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around a face that might have been beautiful once, before whatever had happened to her in that warehouse. Her clothes were torn and stained, with substances that told their own story of suffering, but it was her eyes that disturbed Frost the most. They weren't the vacant stare of someone who'd been broken by torture. They weren't the desperate hope of someone begging for rescue. They were calculating, aware, as if despite her apparent condition, some part of her was still actively processing everything around her. Subject appears to be in severe psychological distress, Dr. Kane had noted in his initial assessment. Physical examination reveals evidence of extensive trauma consistent with prolonged torture. Multiple contusions, lacerations, and what appear to be electrical burn marks. However, the pattern of injuries is unusual. Frost had pressed him for details. Unusual how? Kane had hesitated, the way medical professionals do when the evidence doesn't match their training. The injuries are severe, but they're also precisely placed. Almost methodical. As if whoever did this knew exactly how much damage to inflict without causing permanent harm or death. Professional torture, Frost had concluded. Someone who knew what they were doing. Maybe, Kane had agreed. But there's something else. Her pain responses are inconsistent with the severity of her injuries. When I examine the wounds, she shows almost no reaction. No flinching, no involuntary muscle tension, no changes in heart rate or breathing. It's like she doesn't feel pain. The way normal people do. That had been 3 days ago. 3 days of failed interrogation attempts. 3 days of the woman sitting in her corner, occasionally accepting food and water, but never speaking, never responding to questions, never showing any sign that she understood or cared about her situation. Corporal Blake Hunter had been assigned as her primary guard, and he'd developed an uncomfortable fascination with the prisoner. A 26-year-old from rural Montana. He'd joined the military, straight out of high school, and worked his way up through discipline and dedication rather than exceptional talent. He wasn't brilliant like the interrogators or educated like the medical staff, but he was observant in the way that came from growing up in country, where paying attention to details could mean the difference between finding your way home and spending the night lost in the wilderness. And he'd noticed things about Subject 7 Alpha that the experts seemed to be missing. The way she positioned herself in the cell wasn't random. She'd chosen the corner that gave her the best view of both the door and the observation window while keeping her back protected by solid walls. When guards entered to deliver food, her apparent catatonic state never prevented her from tracking their movements with peripheral vision. And despite her seeming helplessness, she never showed the involuntary startled responses that genuine trauma victims exhibited. "Sir," he'd mentioned to Dr. Kane during one of the medical checkups, "I think she's faking some of this." Kane had looked up from his clipboard with the patronizing expression that educated people reserve for suggestions from enlisted personnel. Corporal, psychological trauma manifests in complex ways. What might appear to be deliberate behavior is often an unconscious coping mechanism. But Hunter wasn't convinced. He'd grown up around wounded animals, had learned to distinguish between creatures that were genuinely hurt and those that were playing dead to avoid predators. Subject 7 Alpha reminded him of a fox he'd once found that had been caught in a trap. The animal had appeared nearly dead when he'd first approached, but the moment he'd reached down to help it, the fox had exploded into motion with speed and aggression that had nearly cost him several fingers. There was something about the woman in Chamber 9 that set off every instinct he'd developed over years of military service. She wasn't what she appeared to be. And sooner or later, everyone else was going to figure that out. The question was whether they'd figure it out before she decided to stop playing whatever game she was playing. As the sun set behind the Colorado mountains, casting long shadows through the facility's reinforced windows, Subject 7 Alpha continued her vigil in the corner of Chamber 9. To anyone watching the security feeds, She appeared to be exactly what they expected. A broken woman destroyed by torture, clinging to what remained of her sanity, but hidden beneath her torn clothing, invisible to the cameras and unnoticed by her captors. 4 small words were tattooed in precise military script behind her left shoulder blade. Words that would change everything once someone finally thought to look for them. Pain. Immunity training complete. Thought the discovery was still hours away. But when it came, it would shatter every assumption the staff at Steelwater had made about warfare, about human endurance, and about the woman they thought they were holding prisoner. Because Subject 7 Alpha wasn't a victim at all. She was something far more dangerous, a weapon that had been designed to be underestimated. The morning briefing room at Steelwater buzzed with the controlled energy that came from dealing with a case that didn't fit any of their established protocols. Agent Samantha Frost sat at the head of the conference table, her laptop open to files that contained more questions than answers. Around her, the facility's senior staff waited for direction on how to proceed with their most puzzling prisoner. Frost had built her reputation on reading people. After 12 years in intelligence work, she could spot a lie from across a room, identify psychological weaknesses within minutes of conversation, and break down the mental defenses of even the most hardened operatives. Her success rate was legendary within the intelligence community, a 93% confession rate that had made her the go-to interrogator for the most sensitive cases. But Subject 7 Alpha was different. In 3 days of attempted interrogation, Frost hadn't managed to extract a single word from the woman, not even a name. The prisoner simply sat in her corner, occasionally accepting food and water, but showing no acknowledgement that she understood language, recognized authority, or cared about her circumstances. "Let's review what we know," Frost began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. Subject was discovered in what appears to be a torture chamber. Physical evidence suggests she was held captive for an extended period. No identification, no matches in any database, no response to questioning in English, Spanish, Arabic, Farsi, or Russian. Dr. Kane shifted in his seat, his medical bag resting beside his chair, like a constant reminder of his role in this theater of controlled suffering. Her physical condition is consistent with prolonged torture, but there are anomalies in her. Pain responses that I can't adequately explain through conventional medical understanding. "Elaborate," Frost commanded. Kane opened his tablet and pulled up the medical assessment he'd conducted the previous day. "When I examine her injuries, and there are extensive injuries, she shows minimal physiological response to pain stimuli. Heart rate remains steady, breathing doesn't change, no involuntary muscle contractions. It's as if her nervous system has been modified somehow." Commander Rebecca Shaw, the facility's commanding officer, leaned forward with interest. Shaw had spent 28 years in military intelligence, rising through ranks that didn't traditionally welcome women through a combination of exceptional competence and ruthless determination. She'd overseen interrogations that had prevented terrorist attacks, extracted information that had saved American lives, and made decisions that kept her awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if there had been another way. "Are we talking about some kind of drug?" Shaw asked. "Chemical conditioning that would suppress pain responses?" "That's what I thought initially," Kane replied. But toxicology screens came back clean. No evidence of narcotics, no unusual chemical compounds in her system. Whatever's causing this appears to be natural, or at least not chemical in origin. Corporal Hunter stood near the back of the room, technically present to provide security rather than participate in the discussion. But his growing unease about the prisoner had been gnawing at him for days, and he found himself speaking before military protocol could stop him. "Permission to speak, ma'am." Shaw nodded, curious about what the young enlisted man might have observed that the experts had missed. "Ma'am, I've been watching her for 3 days now. She's not acting like someone Who's been tortured? She's acting like someone who's pretending to have been tortured. The room fell silent. Frost's expression shifted from professional interest to barely concealed irritation. Corporal, I appreciate your observations, but psychological trauma manifests in complex ways that require specialized training to interpret. Hunter felt. His face flushed but pressed on. Ma'am, I grew up on a ranch. You learn to tell the difference between an animal that's hurt and one that's playing dead. This woman ... she's playing dead. That's enough, Corporal, Shaw said quietly, but Hunter caught something in her tone that suggested she wasn't entirely dismissing his concerns. Frost stood and walked to the window that looked out over the Colorado mountains. The facility had been built into the mountainside, not just for security, but for psychological effect. Prisoners who looked out these windows saw nothing but endless wilderness, a reminder that they were completely isolated from any hope of rescue or escape. I'll conduct another interrogation session this afternoon, she announced. Dr. Kane, I want you present to monitor her physiological responses. Commander Shaw, I'm requesting permission to escalate to enhanced interrogation techniques if necessary. Shaw's jaw tightened. Enhanced interrogation was a euphemism that covered a range of techniques that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal, between necessary and unconscionable. Agent Frost, the subject appears to have already been subjected to significant trauma. Are you certain that additional pressure is warranted? Commander, this woman was found in a terrorist cell's torture chamber. She may have information about planned attacks, about other cells, about operations that could threaten American lives. My job isn't to provide therapy, it's to extract information by whatever means necessary. Dr. Kane cleared his throat uncomfortably. Agent Frost, from a medical standpoint, I should note that her unusual pain responses might make traditional pressure techniques less effective than you'd expect. Then we'll get creative, Frost replied with the cold efficiency that had made. Her reputation. Everyone has a breaking point, Doctor. It's just a matter of finding it. What none of them knew was that Subject 7 Alpha had been listening to every word of their conversation. The surveillance equipment in Chamber 9 was sophisticated enough to monitor conversations in adjacent rooms, and she'd spent her 3 days of apparent catatonia learning everything she could about the facility's layout, personnel, and procedures. She knew that Agent Frost had a younger sister who lived in Portland and worked as a teacher. She knew that Dr. Kane was recently divorced and struggling with custody arrangements for his 2 children. She knew that Commander Shaw had lost her son in Afghanistan and threw herself into her work to avoid dealing with the grief. She knew that Corporal Hunter was the only one who'd begun to suspect the truth about her condition, which made him either the most dangerous person in the facility or potentially useful, depending on how the situation developed. Most importantly, she knew that they were planning to escalate their interrogation techniques, which met her window for maintaining her cover was closing rapidly. Soon, she'd have to make a decision about whether to continue the charade or reveal enough of her true capabilities to change the dynamic of her captivity. The training she'd received had prepared her for exactly this scenario. Capture, interrogation, psychological pressure, all of it was familiar territory. What made this situation unique was that her captors weren't enemy forces. They were Americans, operating under the assumption that she was a threat to national security, which meant that when the truth finally came out, the fallout would be far more complex than anyone in that briefing room could imagine. As the staff meeting concluded and personnel dispersed to their various duties, Subject 7 Alpha continued her vigil in Chamber 9. To the cameras monitoring her cell, she appeared exactly as she had for 3 days, a broken woman clinging to what remained of her sanity. But behind her carefully constructed facade, she was calculating distances, timing guard rotations, and preparing for the moment when patience would no longer be sufficient to achieve her objectives. That moment was coming sooner than anyone expected. The interrogation room at Steelwater had been designed by psychologists who understood that environment could be as effective as any physical technique in breaking down a subject's mental defenses. The walls were painted an off-white color that seemed to shift and blur under the harsh fluorescent lighting. The temperature was kept precisely at 64 degrees, cold enough to be uncomfortable, but not cold enough to be considered torture by international standards. The chair where subjects sat was positioned so that they faced a mirror that was actually one-way glass, creating the psychological pressure of being watched by unseen observers. Agent Frost had used this room to break foreign spies who'd been trained to resist interrogation for months. She'd extracted confessions from domestic terrorists who'd been prepared to die rather than reveal their plans. She'd turned hardened criminals into cooperative witnesses who testified against their former associates. The room had never failed her, but as she sat across from Subject 7 Alpha that afternoon, Frost felt the first stirrings of doubt about her own abilities. The prisoner had been brought in by 2 guards, her hands secured with restraints that were more for show than necessity. She moved with the shuffling gait of someone who'd been broken by prolonged captivity, her head down, her posture screaming submission and defeat. When the guards seated her in the interrogation chair, she slumped forward like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Dr. Kane sat in the corner, his medical equipment arranged on a small table beside his chair. Heart rate monitor, blood pressure cuff, various instruments designed to measure physiological responses to stress. His role was to ensure that the interrogation didn't cross the line from aggressive questioning into actual torture, though the line itself was often more theoretical than practical. Subject 7 Alpha, Frost began, her voice carrying the authoritative tone that had intimidated countless prisoners before. We know you understand English. We know you're aware of your situation. This will go much easier for everyone if you cooperate. The woman in the chair didn't respond, didn't even raise her head. She sat perfectly still, breathing slowly and evenly, showing no recognition that words had been spoken. Frost tried a different approach. You were found in a terrorist facility. We have evidence that you were involved in planning attacks against American citizens. People are going to die unless you help us stop what's coming. Still nothing. No reaction, no change in posture, no indication that the accusation had any meaning for her. Dr. Kane watched his instruments with growing puzzlement. The subject's heart rate remained steady at 68 beats per minute. Her blood pressure was slightly elevated, but within normal ranges. Her breathing pattern hadn't changed since she'd entered the room. Either she was genuinely catatonic, or she had achieved a level of psychological control that shouldn't have been possible for someone who'd supposedly been tortured for weeks. Frost stood and began pacing around the chair, a technique designed to create psychological pressure by forcing the subject to wonder where the interrogator was without being able to track their movement directly. Let me tell you what I think happened, she said, her voice taking on the conversational tone that often preceded breakthrough moments in interrogations. I think you got involved with people you didn't understand. I think they promised you something: money, ideology, revenge against some perceived injustice, and you believed them. And then when their operation went bad, they decided you were expendable. She paused directly behind the subject's chair, close enough that her breath would be felt on the back of the woman's neck. They tortured you, didn't they? Made you suffer for their failures. And now you're protecting them, even though they threw you away like garbage. Why would you do that? What kind of loyalty do you owe to people who destroyed you? For just a moment, Dr. Kane thought he detected a change in the subject's breathing pattern. A slight acceleration, barely perceptible but measurable on his equipment. He made a note and continued monitoring. Frost returned to her seat and leaned forward, invading the subject's personal space in a way that was designed to create unconscious discomfort. Here's what's going to happen, she said quietly. You're Going to tell me who you're working for. You're going to tell me what attacks are planned. You're going to give me names, locations, timelines. And in exchange, I'm going to make sure you're treated well. Medical care, decent food, protection from the people who did this to you. She paused, studying the subject's face for any sign of reaction. Or you can continue this performance, and I'll be forced to use methods that make what those terrorists did to you look like a massage. The choice is yours. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn. Dr. Kane shifted uncomfortably in his chair, knowing that they were approaching the boundary between legal interrogation and something that would require him to make difficult decisions about his medical oath. But Subject 7 Alpha gave no indication that she'd heard the threat. She continued, sitting in her slumped position, breathing steadily, showing no awareness of her surroundings or circumstances. Frost tried for another 30 minutes, alternating between accusations and offers, threats and promises. She spoke in different languages, showed photographs of terrorist attacks, even played recordings of supposed communications between terrorist cells. Nothing generated any response whatsoever. Finally, she stood and walked to the one-way mirror, her frustration evident in every line of her body. Behind the glass, Commander Shaw watched with growing concern. In her 28 years of military service, she'd never seen an interrogation subject maintain such complete psychological distance from their circumstances. Subject appears to be genuinely catatonic, Frost announced to the room, her professional pride taking a significant blow from the admission. Dr. Kane, is it possible that the torture she endured caused permanent psychological damage? Kane reviewed his readings, his medical training warring with his growing suspicions about what he was witnessing. It's possible, but her physiological responses don't support that diagnosis. Her stress indicators remain remarkably stable. If she were genuinely catatonic, I'd expect to see different patterns in her autonomic nervous system responses. Frost turned back to the subject, her patience finally beginning to crack. You know what I think? I think you're playing games. I think you're sitting there feeling very clever about your little act. But this isn't a movie, and you're not the hero of some story where silence equals nobility. She approached the chair. Again, her voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. Everyone breaks eventually. Everyone. It's not a question of if, it's a question of how much damage gets done in the process. You can make this easy on yourself, or you can make it very, very difficult. But either way, you will tell me what I need to know. For the first time since entering the room, the subject moved. It was barely perceptible, a slight shift in her posture, a minor adjustment in how she held her head. But Dr. Kane caught it on his instruments. A momentary spike in heart rate, followed immediately by a return to the previous steady rhythm. The reaction had lasted less than 3 seconds. But it told him something important. Subject 7 Alpha was not only aware of everything happening around her, she was actively controlling her physiological responses with a level of precision that suggested extensive training in exactly this type of situation. Agent Frost, he said quietly, I need to speak with you outside. Frost looked frustrated by the interruption, but followed Kane out of the interrogation room. In the corridor, away from the subject's hearing, Kane shared his observations. She's not catatonic, he said definitively. Her physiological control is too precise, too deliberate. Someone who'd been genuinely broken by torture wouldn't be able to maintain that level of conscious regulation over their autonomic responses. Then what is she? Frost demanded. I don't know, Kane admitted. But whoever she is, she's been trained for exactly this scenario. The question is, trained by whom? Inside the interrogation room, Subject 7 Alpha continued her performance of psychological devastation. But behind her carefully constructed facade, she was analyzing every word she'd heard, every technique that had been attempted, every weakness. She'd observed in her captor's approach. The interrogation had failed completely, which meant they would escalate to more aggressive methods. That was when things would become truly interesting, because they still had no idea what they were actually dealing with. The security office at Steelwater operated 24 hours a day, its walls lined with monitors that displayed feeds from every camera in the facility. Corporal Blake Hunter had pulled the night shift, which meant 8 hours of watching empty corridors and sleeping prisoners, while the rest of the facility wound down for the evening. It should have been the most boring assignment in the military, but Hunter found himself increasingly fascinated by the feed from Chamber 9. Subject 7 Alpha hadn't moved from her corner in over 6 hours. She sat with her knees drawn up, arms wrapped around her legs, head resting against the concrete wall. To anyone glancing at the monitor, she appeared to be exactly what Dr. Kane's reports described, a woman broken by torture, clinging to what remained of her sanity. But Hunter had been watching her for 3 nights now, and he'd begun to notice patterns that bothered him. Every 47 minutes, she shifted position. Not randomly, not because of discomfort, but with mechanical precision that suggested an internal clock rather than natural movement. When she accepted food from the guards, she always took exactly 3 bites before setting it aside, regardless of what was served. And most disturbing of all, her breathing pattern never changed. Even during sleep, assuming she actually slept. Hunter had grown up in country where survival sometimes depended on reading animal behavior correctly. A deer that grazed too calmly near a predator was either sick or already dead. A horse that showed no reaction to approaching storms was either deaf or operating on instincts that override normal fear responses. Subject 7 Alpha reminded him of those animals, too controlled, too consistent, too perfect in her portrayal of helplessness. At 0347 hours, something different happened. The facility's backup generator kicked in during a routine test, causing a momentary power fluctuation that dimmed the lights throughout the complex. Most prisoners would have reacted to the sudden change, looking around, showing anxiety, perhaps calling out to guards for reassurance. Subject 7 Alpha didn't even blink. But in the split second when the lights dimmed, Hunter saw her eyes move with precise calculation to the camera in her cell, then to the door, then to the ventilation grate in the ceiling. It happened so quickly that anyone not specifically watching, for it would have missed it entirely. She was mapping escape routes. Hunter made a note in his log and continued watching. 20 minutes later, when the guard rotation brought Sergeant Derek Stone through the corridors for the 0400 security check, Hunter observed something else that made his blood run cold. Stone was new to Steelwater, transferred in just 2 weeks earlier from a base in Germany. He was competent, but not exceptional. The kind of career NCO who followed protocols precisely because he'd learned that deviation led to problems. When he reached Chamber 9, he followed standard procedure: visual confirmation of prisoner location, quick scan of the cell for contraband or signs of self-harm, notation in his handheld device. But as Stone moved past the cell, Subject 7 Alpha's head moved almost imperceptibly. Her eyes, supposedly vacant and unfocused, tracked the sergeant's movement with the precision of a predator watching prey. When Stone stopped to make his notation, she studied his equipment, his posture, the way he held his weapon. She was conducting her own surveillance, gathering intelligence on her captors with the methodical thoroughness of a professional. Hunter reached for his phone to call Dr. Kane, then hesitated. The medical officer had made it clear that he considered Hunter's observations to be the product of an overactive imagination rather than genuine insight. Reporting this would likely result in nothing more than another condescending explanation about trauma responses and the dangers of projecting patterns onto random behavior. Instead, Hunter decided to conduct his own test. He waited until Stone had completed his rounds and the corridors were empty again. Then he left the security office and walked slowly past Chamber 9, making sure his footsteps were clearly audible. As he approached the cell, he deliberately fumbled with his radio, dropping it with a clatter that echoed through the concrete hallway. Any normal prisoner, especially one suffering from trauma-induced hypervigilance, would have reacted to the sudden noise. Fear, curiosity, defensive positioning, something that indicated awareness of a potential threat or opportunity. Subject 7 Alpha didn't move. But Hunter caught what he was looking for, the subtle change in her breathing pattern that indicated she was listening intently, processing the information, analyzing whether the noise represented danger or opportunity. She was awake, aware, and actively gathering intelligence. Everything else was an act. Hunter returned to the security office with his suspicions confirmed, but also with a growing sense of unease. If Subject 7 Alpha was faking her condition, it meant she was extraordinarily skilled at psychological manipulation. But more troubling was the question of why someone with such capabilities would allow herself to be captured and held in a facility like Steelwater. Either she was exactly what she appeared to be, a terrorist operative who'd been broken by torture, or she was something else entirely. Something that made her presence at Steelwater part of a larger plan that no one at the facility understood. The next morning brought another briefing, another discussion of failed interrogation techniques, another round of medical assessments that revealed nothing useful. Dr. Kane presented his findings about the subject's unusual physiological control, but offered no conclusions about what it might mean. Agent Frost announced her intention to escalate to enhanced interrogation techniques. Despite Kane's medical reservations, Commander Shaw approved the escalation with visible reluctance, knowing that failure to extract information could have consequences that extended far beyond their facility. Through it all, Corporal Hunter sat quietly in the back of the room, wrestling with knowledge that he couldn't prove and suspicions that no one wanted to hear. He'd been raised to trust authority, to follow orders, to assume that people with more education and experience knew better than a kid from rural Montana, but every instinct he developed over years of military service was screaming that they were making a terrible mistake. That afternoon, as preparations began for the enhanced interrogation session scheduled for the following day, Hunter made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find a way to prove that Subject 7 Alpha wasn't what she appeared to be. He didn't know yet that the proof was already there, hidden beneath her torn clothing in the form of 4 words that would redefine everything they thought. They knew about warfare, about training, and about the woman they believed they were holding prisoner, but he was about to find out that some truths were too dangerous to leave hidden, and that the difference between a prisoner and a weapon sometimes came down to nothing more than who was asking the right questions. Meanwhile, in Chamber 9, Subject 7 Alpha continued her vigil. But her patience was wearing thin, and the window for maintaining her cover was closing rapidly. Soon, she would have to decide whether to continue the charade or reveal enough of her true capabilities to change the fundamental dynamics of her captivity. The enhanced interrogation scheduled for tomorrow would force that decision. One way or another, the truth was about to come out. And when it did, everyone at Steelwater would discover that they'd been playing a game whose rules they didn't understand, against an opponent whose capabilities exceeded their worst nightmares. Dr. Oliver Kane had always prided himself on his methodical approach to medicine. 23 years of military service had taught him that lives often depended on attention to details that others might overlook. A soldier's slightly elevated temperature could indicate the early stages of a life-threatening infection. An unusual bruise pattern might reveal internal bleeding that required immediate surgery. In the controlled environment of Steelwater, where prisoners' health was both a legal requirement and a tactical necessity, those observational skills had served him well. But Subject 7 Alpha was presenting medical anomalies that challenged everything. He thought he understood about human physiology and psychology. The enhanced interrogation session was scheduled, for 1,400 hours, which meant Kane needed to conduct a thorough medical examination to establish baseline measurements and ensure the subject could withstand more aggressive questioning techniques. Standard protocol required documentation of existing injuries, assessment of psychological state, and verification that enhanced methods wouldn't cause permanent damage or death. Kane had conducted hundreds of such examinations over his career. They were routine clinical assessments that reduced human suffering to checkboxes on government forms. But as he prepared his equipment that morning, he found himself hoping that the examination would finally provide answers to questions that had been troubling him for days. Subject 7 Alpha was brought to the medical facility at 0900 hours, escorted by 2 guards who treated her with the careful distance reserved for unpredictable animals. She shuffled into the examination room with the same broken posture she'd maintained since arrival, allowing herself to be positioned on the examination table without resistance or acknowledgement. Subject 7 Alpha, Kane began, following protocol. Despite his growing certainty that she understood every word, "I'm going to conduct a medical examination to assess your current condition. This is for your own safety and well-being." The woman on the table gave no indication that she'd heard him. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged, her eyes focused on some invisible point beyond the ceiling tiles. Kane began with basic vital signs. Heart rate, 68 beats per minute, exactly the same as every previous measurement. Blood pressure, 118/76, within normal ranges and remarkably consistent with previous readings. Temperature, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, precisely normal. The consistency itself was unusual. Most people showed minor variations in vital signs throughout the day, influenced by stress, fatigue, hydration, and countless other factors. Subject 7 Alpha's readings were so consistent they looked like someone had programmed a machine to generate ideal numbers. The physical examination revealed the same injuries Kane had documented previously: extensive bruising across her torso, linear marks consistent with electrical burns, and what appeared to be ligature marks on her wrists and ankles. But as he examined the injuries more closely, Kane noticed something that made him pause. The bruising showed healing patterns that didn't match the timeline of her supposed captivity. Bruises aged in predictable ways, changing color and fading according to well-established medical markers. Subject 7 Alpha's injuries showed healing stages that spanned weeks rather than days, suggesting either that she'd been tortured for much longer than initially estimated, or that the injuries had been inflicted in a pattern that defied normal torture methodology. More disturbing were the electrical burn marks. Kane had seen similar injuries in soldiers who'd been captured and tortured by enemy forces, but these burns were different. They were precisely placed, methodically spaced, and showed evidence of repeated application over time. Someone had used electrical torture not to extract information quickly, but as part of a prolonged conditioning process. But the most puzzling discovery came when Kane tested the subject's pain responses. Using a standard medical instrument designed to measure pain sensitivity, he applied controlled pressure to various points on her body. The results were impossible. Subject 7 Alpha showed virtually no pain response to stimuli that should have caused significant discomfort. When Kane pressed the instrument against areas of fresh bruising, her heart rate didn't change. When he applied pressure to nerve clusters that would normally cause involuntary flinching, she remained perfectly still. Even when he tested her reflexes with a standard percussion hammer, her responses were muted to the point of being barely detectable. "This is impossible," Kane muttered to himself, checking his instruments to ensure they were functioning properly. He tried a different approach, testing her responses to temperature variations. Most torture victims developed heightened sensitivity to thermal stimuli as a result of nerve damage and psychological conditioning. But when Kane applied controlled heat and cold to various parts of her body, Subject 7 Alpha showed no reaction whatsoever. It was as if her nervous system had been rewired to suppress pain signals completely. Kane had read about experimental, military programs designed to increase soldiers' pain tolerance through psychological conditioning and pharmaceutical intervention. Theoretical research suggested it might be possible to train individuals to override natural pain responses through intensive mental conditioning combined with gradual exposure to increasing levels of discomfort. But what he was observing went far beyond enhanced pain tolerance. This was complete pain immunity, something that medical science considered theoretically possible, but practically unachievable without causing permanent neurological damage. As the examination continued, Kane discovered additional anomalies that deepened the mystery. Subject 7 Alpha's muscle tone was inconsistent with someone who'd been held captive and tortured for weeks. Despite her apparent psychological devastation, her physical conditioning suggested recent, intensive training. Her muscle groups showed the development patterns typical of someone who'd undergone specialized physical conditioning, the kind seen in elite military units or professional athletes. Her hands revealed calluses and patterns that suggested extensive weapons training. Not the random wear patterns of manual labor, but the specific markings left by prolonged exposure to military firearms, climbing equipment, and tactical gear. Most puzzling of all were the small scars Kane found scattered across her body. They weren't from torture or accident. They were too precise, too methodically placed. They looked like training scars, the kind that accumulated over years of specialized military instruction, where pain tolerance was built through controlled, progressive exposure to injury. When Kane attempted to examine these scars more closely, something unprecedented happened. For just a moment, so briefly that he almost missed it, Subject 7 Alpha's eyes focused directly on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but in that brief instant, Kane saw something that shattered his understanding of their prisoner's condition, intelligence, calculation, the focused awareness of someone who was completely in control of their circumstances. Then, the moment passed and she returned to her vacant stare, leaving Kane to wonder if he'd imagined the entire interaction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Kane completed his examination in growing confusion and alarm. Every medical indicator suggested that Subject 7 Alpha had undergone conditioning that was far beyond anything in conventional military training. Her pain immunity wasn't the result of torture, it was the result of specialized training, designed to create exactly the capabilities she was demonstrating. But if that was true, it meant she wasn't a victim at all. She was something else entirely, a weapon that had been designed to be underestimated, captured, and dismissed as harmless. As Kane prepared his report for Agent Frost, he faced a dilemma that challenged both his medical oath and his loyalty to the mission. His findings suggested that everything they believed about Subject 7 Alpha was wrong, but proving it would require procedures that crossed ethical boundaries he wasn't prepared to breach. The enhanced interrogation was scheduled to begin in 4 hours. If Kane was right about what he'd discovered, those sessions weren't going to extract information from a broken victim. They were going to test the limits of capabilities that exceeded anything in their operational manuals. And Kane had the growing suspicion that Subject 7 Alpha was counting on exactly that scenario to reveal her true nature to people who were finally asking the right questions. The medical examination had raised more questions than it answered. But one thing was becoming clear. The woman in Chamber 9 wasn't what anyone at Steelwater had assumed her to be. The truth was hidden somewhere beneath her carefully constructed facade of psychological devastation. And Kane was beginning to suspect that the truth was far more dangerous than anyone at the facility was prepared to handle. The enhanced interrogation room at Steelwater had been designed by experts who understood that breaking the human being required more than just physical discomfort. The chamber was smaller than the standard interrogation room, with walls painted in a shade of gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The air circulation system had been modified to create subtle pressure changes that induced claustrophobia without being obvious enough to constitute torture under international law. Agent Frost stood outside the chamber at 13:55 hours, reviewing Dr. Kane's medical report one final time. The document raised more questions than it answered, but her superiors had made it clear that failure to extract information from Subject 7 Alpha was not an acceptable outcome. Too many variables suggested that this woman possessed intelligence about planned terrorist operations, and the potential cost of ignorance far outweighed the ethical concerns about aggressive interrogation. Agent Frost, Dr. Kane approached. With visible reluctance, his medical bag in one hand and a thick folder in the other. "I need to discuss my findings before we proceed." Frost looked up from the report, her patience already strained by days of failed attempts to break their prisoner. "Doctor, your examination confirmed that the subject is physically capable of withstanding enhanced interrogation. That's all I need to know." "No, it isn't," Kane replied with uncharacteristic firmness. "Agent Frost, the anomalies I've documented aren't consistent with torture trauma. They're consistent with specialized training designed to create exactly the capabilities this woman is demonstrating." Frost's expression shifted from impatience to sharp attention. "Explain." Kane opened his folder and pulled out a series of photographs, showing the subject's scars and injury patterns. These aren't random torture marks. They're methodical, progressive, designed to build pain tolerance through controlled exposure over extended periods. This is conditioning, not abuse. Conditioning. By whom? That's what we need to find out before we proceed. Because if I'm right, enhanced interrogation isn't going to break this woman. It's going to activate capabilities we don't understand. Before Frost could respond, Commander Shaw's voice crackled through her radio. "Agent Frost, we have a situation. Admiral Knox is en route to the facility. ETA 20 minutes. Frost felt her blood pressure spike. Admiral Gabriel Knox was the kind of senior officer whose unexpected visits meant that someone's career was about to end badly. His presence at Steelwater suggested that Subject 7 Alpha's case had attracted attention at levels far above the facility's normal operational scope. "Copy that, Commander. We're proceeding with the enhanced session as scheduled." "Negative." Shaw's voice carried an edge that brooked no argument. "Hold all interrogation activities until the Admiral arrives. That's a direct order." Frost closed her eyes and counted to 10, fighting the urge to ignore the command and proceed anyway. 4 days of failed attempts to extract information from their prisoner had pushed her professional pride to the breaking point, and the prospect of explaining that failure to Admiral Knox was almost unbearable. But orders were orders, even when they came at the worst possible moment. "Dr. Kane," she said quietly, "I want you to conduct one more examination. This time, I want you to look for anything that might explain who this woman really is." Kane nodded and headed toward Chamber 9, followed by 2 guards and Agent Frost herself. Something about the timing of Admiral Knox's visit suggested that there were aspects of this case that hadn't been shared with the facility staff. And Kane had learned over years of military service that crucial information was often hidden in the details that everyone else overlooked. Subject 7 Alpha was brought to the medical facility for the second time that day, displaying the same broken posture and vacant stare that had characterized her behavior since arrival. But as Kane began his examination, he noticed something different in her demeanor. The change was subtle, a slight tension in her shoulders, a minor alteration in her breathing pattern, but it suggested increased alertness rather than continued psychological devastation. "I'm going to need to examine your back and shoulders," Kane announced, Following medical protocol, despite his certainty that she understood every word. As Kane helped position the subject for the examination, his hands encountered something unexpected. Beneath her torn clothing, just behind her left shoulder blade, he felt the raised texture of a tattoo. The discovery wasn't unusual in itself. Many military personnel carried tattoos that marked significant events or unit affiliations, but something about this particular marking made Kane pause. "Agent Frost," he said quietly, "I need you to see this." Frost moved closer as Kane carefully moved the fabric aside to reveal the tattoo. What they saw made both of them freeze in shock. Silence. The marking was small, precisely executed in black ink that had been applied with military precision. But it wasn't the tattoo itself that stopped their breathing. It was what it said. 4 words in clean block letters: "Pain immunity training complete." Below the words was a symbol that Kane recognized from classified briefings he'd attended years earlier. The insignia of Shadow Company, an elite unit that officially didn't exist and whose operations were denied by every level of government. But beneath that symbol was something even more shocking: a series of numbers and letters that Kane realized were service identifiers for programs so classified that their very existence was considered a national security secret. "Jesus Christ," Frost whispered, her voice barely audible. Subject 7 Alpha wasn't a terrorist who'd been broken by torture. She wasn't a victim who'd been captured and abused by enemy operatives. She was a graduate of the most advanced resistance training program in the history of military science, a program designed to create operatives who could withstand any form of interrogation, survive any form of captivity, and maintain operational effectiveness under conditions that would destroy ordinary human beings. The Enhanced Conditioning Protocol was a theoretical program that Kane had heard referenced in medical journals and classified briefings, but he'd assumed it was still in experimental stages. The idea of creating soldiers with complete pain immunity had been discussed for decades, but the psychological and physiological requirements were considered too extreme for practical implementation. Apparently, he'd been wrong, Agent Frost. Kane said slowly, his medical training warring with the implications of what he'd discovered. "This woman isn't our prisoner, we're hers." Before Frost could respond, the sound of helicopter rotors filled the air outside the facility. Admiral Knox had arrived, and Kane had the sinking suspicion that the senior officer already knew exactly who they'd been holding in Chamber 9. As if responding to some internal signal, Subject 7 Alpha raised her head for the first time in 4 days and looked directly at Agent Frost with eyes that held no trace of psychological damage or confusion. "Hello, Agent Frost," she said quietly, her voice carrying the controlled authority of someone who'd been in complete control of the situation from the very beginning. "I think it's time we had a proper conversation." The woman they'd known as Subject 7 Alpha was gone. In her place sat someone whose presence immediately changed the fundamental dynamics of everything that had been happening at Steelwater for the past 4 days. The broken victim had been an act. The real question was, what was the mission that had required such an elaborate deception? And more importantly, what did it mean that they'd just discovered the truth at the exact moment when Admiral Knox had arrived to take control of the situation? Kane had the growing suspicion that they were about to find out that their prisoner had never been captured at all. She had been inserted into their facility for reasons that none of them understood, and her apparent torture and psychological breakdown had been nothing more than cover for an operation that was far more complex than anyone at Steelwater could have imagined. Admiral Gabriel Knox stepped out of the military helicopter with the bearing of a man who'd spent 43 years making decisions that shaped the course of nations. At 61, he still carried himself with the ramrod posture that had been drilled into him at Annapolis decades earlier, but his eyes held the weight of knowledge that came from operating in the shadows where official policies met unofficial necessities. The flight to Steelwater had given him time to review the classified files that most of the facility staff would never have clearance to access. Files that explained exactly who they'd been holding in Chamber 9, why she was there, and what it meant that her true identity had finally been discovered. Knox had been hoping they wouldn't figure it out this quickly. Commander Shaw met him at the landing pad, her expression carrying the barely controlled tension of someone who knew their career was hanging in the balance. "Admiral, we have a situation that requires immediate." "I know exactly what situation you have." "Commander," Knox interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been briefed on details that others could only guess at. "Take me to Captain Iris Thorne immediately." Shaw's confusion was evident in every line of her face. "Sir, we have no personnel by that name. Our subject is designated 7 Alpha, and her identity remains unknown." Knox stopped walking and fixed Shaw with a stare that could have melted steel. "Commander, the woman you've been holding for 4 days is Captain Iris Thorne, Shadow Company Endurance Division, graduate of the Enhanced Conditioning Protocol, and one of the most highly classified operatives in the history of American military intelligence." The words hit Shaw like physical blows. Shadow Company was a name that appeared in intelligence briefings, so classified that even mentioning it required special authorization. The Enhanced Conditioning Protocol was a theoretical program that existed more in whispered conversations than official documentation. "Sir, that's impossible. She was discovered in a terrorist torture chamber. She's been completely unresponsive to all interrogation attempts." Knox resumed walking toward the facility, his stride sharp with purpose. "Commander, Captain Thorne has been unresponsive because she's been conducting a classified operation that your facility accidentally interfered with. What you interpreted as torture trauma was actually the cover identity for a deep penetration mission that has been 18 months in the planning." As they entered the main building, Knox continued his explanation in the clipped tones of someone delivering a briefing that would reshape everything the listener thought they understood about their situation. 3 weeks ago, intelligence indicated that a terrorist cell operating out of Detroit had acquired information about Steelwater's location and operational procedures. The cell was planning to either attack this facility or extract someone you were holding. Captain Thorne was inserted into their operation to identify the threat and neutralize it from within. Shaw felt the world shifting beneath her feet. She was undercover with the terrorists for 6 months. The torture chamber where your people found her was part of her cover identity. The terrorists believed they were conditioning her to resist American interrogation techniques. In reality, she was gathering intelligence about their plans while using her ECP training to maintain her psychological cover. They reached the medical facility where Agent Frost and Dr. Kane were still trying to process the implications of their discovery. Knox entered the examination room where Captain Thorne sat on the medical table, no longer maintaining her facade of psychological devastation. "Captain," Knox said simply. "Admiral," Thorne replied, standing and snapping to attention with military precision that transformed her entire presence. The broken woman was completely gone, replaced by someone whose bearing radiated professional competence and controlled lethality. Agent Frost found her voice first. "Admiral, we had no knowledge of any ongoing operation." "If we'd known." "If you'd known, Agent Frost, the operation would have been compromised from the moment Captain Thorne arrived at this facility. Operational security required that only a handful of people at the highest levels of government knew about her mission." Dr. Kane stepped forward, his medical training demanding answers to questions that his security clearance probably didn't cover. "Admiral, the conditioning this woman has undergone, the pain immunity, the psychological control, how is any of that possible?" Knox looked at Thorne, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of permission. "Doctor, the Enhanced Conditioning Protocol represents 15 years of research into the limits of human psychological and physiological adaptation. Captain Thorne volunteered for experimental training that pushed her beyond what we previously thought possible for the human nervous system to endure. Thorne spoke for the first time since revealing her true identity, her voice carrying the controlled authority of someone accustomed to operating in situations where mistakes meant death. The ECP training involved progressive exposure to increasingly severe physical and psychological stressors over a period of 3 years. The goal was to create operatives who could maintain operational effectiveness under any form of interrogation, torture, or psychological pressure. Kane's medical mind reeled at the implications. The risks to your long-term health, the potential for permanent psychological damage, were acceptable. Thorne interrupted quietly, given the nature of the missions that require this level of conditioning. There are operations that can't be conducted by personnel who might break under extreme pressure. Knox took control of the conversation before it could delve into classified details that even these personnel weren't cleared to. Here, the immediate situation is this. Captain Thorne's cover has been blown, which means her mission parameters have changed. The terrorist cell she was infiltrating has been neutralized, but we now need to conduct a full debrief to determine what intelligence was gathered and what threats remain. Commander Shaw struggled to process the revelation that her facility had been unknowingly hosting a classified operation. "Admiral, what about our protocols, the interrogation attempts? We treated her as a hostile prisoner. Your protocols functioned exactly as designed, Commander." Captain Thorne's conditioning allowed her to maintain her cover while gathering intelligence about your facility's procedures, personnel, and potential vulnerabilities. That information will be invaluable for improving security at similar installations. Agent Frost felt her professional pride crumbling as she realized that every interrogation technique she'd attempted had been ineffective not because of her skills, but because she'd been trying to break someone who was physiologically incapable of being broken by conventional methods. "Agent Frost," Thorne said, reading the devastation in the interrogator's expression, "your techniques were professionally executed. Under normal circumstances, they would have been highly effective. The fact that they didn't work has nothing to do with your competence and everything to do with conditioning that specifically trained me to resist exactly those methods." Knox checked his watch and turned toward the door. "Captain, we need to begin the debrief immediately. Commander Shaw, I'll need a secure conference room and a classified communications link to Washington. Agent Frost, Dr. Kane, everything you've witnessed here falls under national security classifications that will be explained to you during separate briefings." As the group prepared to leave the medical facility, Knox paused and looked back at the personnel who'd spent 4 days trying to unlock the mystery of Subject 7 Alpha. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "Captain Thorne's reports indicate that your facility operates with a level of professionalism and security that exceeds expectations. The fact that her true identity remained hidden for 4 days while she gathered intelligence speaks well of your operational procedures." But even as Knox offered the reassurance, everyone in the room understood that everything they thought they knew about warfare, about interrogation, and about the limits of human endurance had been fundamentally challenged by the discovery of what one highly trained operative could accomplish when underestimated by her captors. The broken woman in Chamber 9 had never existed. In her place was someone whose capabilities redefined the boundaries of what was possible in the shadows, where national security and human psychology intersected in ways that most people would never understand. The truth was more complex and more dangerous than anyone at Steelwater had imagined. And they were about to learn that Captain Iris Thorne's mission was far from over. The secure conference room at Steelwater had been designed for briefings that couldn't leave the mountain facility. Reinforced walls blocked electronic surveillance. White noise generators defeated listening devices, and multiple layers of security ensured that classified conversations remained classified. It was here that Admiral Knox had decided to conduct Captain Thorne's operational debrief, with the facility's senior staff present to understand exactly what they'd been dealing with for the past 4 days. Commander Shaw, Agent Frost, Dr. Kane, and Corporal Hunter sat around the conference table, each struggling to process the revelation that their mysterious prisoner was actually one of the most highly classified operatives in American military history. The woman who'd appeared broken and helpless now sat with perfect military posture, her transformation so complete that it was difficult to believe she was the same person they'd been observing for days. "Before we begin the formal debrief, Admiral," Knox announced, "I think it's important that you understand exactly what the enhanced conditioning protocol accomplished. Captain Thorne, would you demonstrate some of your capabilities for the staff?" Thorne nodded and stood, moving to the center of the room. The ECP training involved 3 primary areas of conditioning: pain immunity, psychological resistance, and physiological control. What you observed during my time here was a practical application of all 3. Dr. Kane leaned forward, his medical curiosity overriding his discomfort with the situation. "Captain, when I conducted pain sensitivity tests during your examination, you showed virtually no response to stimuli that should have caused significant discomfort. How is that possible?" The pain immunity training involved progressive exposure to increasing levels of physical stress over a period of 18 months. Thorne explained with the clinical detachment of someone discussing theoretical concepts rather than personal experience. The process rewires the nervous system's response to pain signals, allowing conscious control over what most people experience as involuntary reactions. To demonstrate, she picked up a pen from the conference table and pressed the point firmly against her palm, applying pressure that should have caused immediate pain and reflex withdrawal. Her expression didn't change, her breathing remained steady, and when she removed the pen, a small puncture wound was visible, but her hand remained perfectly stable. "The training doesn't eliminate the ability to feel pain," she continued. "It eliminates the automatic responses that pain typically triggers: fear, panic, loss of concentration, involuntary movement. All of these can be consciously suppressed when necessary." Agent Frost found her voice, though it carried none of the confidence that had characterized her previous interactions with the subject. "The psychological resistance you demonstrated during interrogation, maintaining your cover identity, despite aggressive questioning, that was also part of your training?" Psychological conditioning was the most complex aspect of the ECP program, Thorne replied. It involved simulated capture scenarios, extended isolation, and exposure to interrogation techniques that pushed beyond conventional military SEER training. The goal was to create multiple psychological layers that could be maintained simultaneously. She moved to the window and looked out at the Colorado mountains, her posture relaxed but alert in the way that suggested constant awareness of her surroundings. "During my time here, I was simultaneously maintaining my cover identity as a broken torture victim while conducting surveillance of your facility's procedures, personnel, and security measures. I was also analyzing each of your interrogation attempts to gather intelligence about American interrogation techniques that could be valuable for future operations." Commander Shaw struggled with the implications of what she was hearing. "Captain, you're saying that while we believed you were our prisoner, you were actually conducting intelligence gathering on our own facility?" "That's correct, Commander. The mission required me to understand how Steelwater operates, what vulnerabilities exist, and how your personnel respond to prisoners who don't fit standard profiles. The intelligence I gathered will be used to improve security at similar facilities and to train future operatives who might find themselves in comparable situations." Knox stepped forward to provide context that the facility staff needed to understand the broader implications of what they'd witnessed. The enhanced conditioning protocol was developed because traditional military training, even elite special operations preparation, has limitations when operatives face the kind of extreme conditions that exist in modern asymmetric warfare. Captain Thorne represents the first generation of personnel who can operate effectively under conditions that would incapacitate conventional soldiers. Dr. Kane raised a question that had been troubling him since the revelation of Thorne's true identity. Admiral, the medical and psychological risks of this conditioning. What are the long-term effects on personnel who undergo this training? The question hung in the air for a moment before Thorne answered it herself. Dr. Kane, the ECP training changes you in ways that can't be reversed. The pain immunity, the psychological compartmentalization, the physiological control, these become permanent aspects of how you experience the world. There are trade-offs that most people wouldn't consider acceptable. She turned from the window to face the medical officer directly. Normal human emotional responses become muted. The ability to form conventional relationships is compromised. The line between mission identity and personal identity can become blurred in ways that create long-term psychological challenges. The military considers these acceptable costs for the operational capabilities the training provides. Corporal Hunter, who had been silent throughout the briefing, finally found the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him since the beginning. Ma'am, if you were conducting a classified operation, why did you let us capture you? Why didn't you just complete your mission and disappear? Thorne smiled for the first time since revealing her identity, and Hunter caught a glimpse of something human beneath the professional facade. Corporal, you were the only person at this facility who suspected that something wasn't right about my condition. Your observations were accurate, and your instincts were sound. If more personnel had your ability to recognize inconsistencies, facility security would be significantly enhanced. She paused and looked around the room at the faces of people who'd spent 4 days trying to understand a puzzle that had no conventional solution. As for why I allowed the capture scenario to proceed, the mission required me to test not only the terrorist cell's operational security, but also the effectiveness of American detention and interrogation procedures when faced with unconventional subjects. The intelligence gathered from both aspects of the operation was deemed valuable enough to justify the risks involved. Admiral Knox checked his watch and moved toward the door. Captain, we need to wrap up this briefing and begin the Pelicon. Formal intelligence debrief. The terrorist cell you were infiltrating provided information about planned operations that require immediate attention. But before the formal proceedings could begin, Knox turned back to the facility staff with an expression that carried both respect and concern. What you've witnessed here represents capabilities that push the boundaries of what we previously thought possible in human conditioning and training. Captain Thorne's abilities are the result of experimental programs that may or may not be expanded depending on their effectiveness and the strategic requirements of future operations. The implication was clear. They'd witnessed the testing of capabilities that could reshape how America conducted operations in the shadows where conventional military force wasn't sufficient and traditional intelligence methods fell short of. What national security required. The broken woman in Chamber 9 had been a carefully constructed lie designed to hide capabilities that redefined the possible. And everyone in that conference room understood that they'd been privileged to witness something that would change how they thought about warfare, about human limitations, and about the prices that some people were willing to pay to operate in the darkness beyond official recognition. The aftermath of Captain Thorne's revelation rippled through Steelwater Detention Center like an earthquake whose tremors would be felt for months to come. Within hours of Admiral Knox's briefing, the facility found itself at the center of a classified review that examined every aspect of how they'd handled the most unusual prisoner in their history. Commander Shaw sat in her office at 2,100 hours, staring at incident reports that would reshape protocols at detention facilities across the country. The woman who'd appeared to be a broken torture Victim had conducted the most comprehensive intelligence assessment of Steelwater's operations that had ever been attempted. Her observations during 4 days of apparent helplessness had revealed vulnerabilities that years of official inspections had missed. She watched everything, Shaw muttered to herself, reviewing Thorne's preliminary intelligence report. Guard rotations, security camera blind spots, personnel weaknesses, communication protocols. She mapped our entire operation while we thought she was catatonic. The irony was almost overwhelming. The facility designed to extract information from prisoners had been thoroughly penetrated by someone they'd assumed was broken beyond the ability to threaten anyone. Agent Frost found herself in a similar state of professional reckoning. Her entire career had been built on the assumption that everyone had a breaking point, that the right combination of pressure and technique could crack any psychological defense. Captain Thorne's resistance hadn't been the result of exceptional willpower or ideological commitment. It had been the product of conditioning that made conventional interrogation techniques irrelevant. 12 years of experience, she said to Dr. Kane as they reviewed the failed interrogation transcripts, and I never came close to understanding what I was dealing with. Kane looked up from his medical notes, his own professional confidence shaken by the encounter with capabilities that challenged everything he thought he understood about human physiology. Agent Frost, we were operating with incomplete information. Captain Thorne's conditioning represents experimental science that's years ahead of anything in conventional military medicine. We can't judge our performance against standards that didn't exist when we received our training. But even as Kane offered the reassurance, both of them understood that the failure went deeper than lack of information. They'd made assumptions based on appearance rather than evidence, and those assumptions had blinded them to possibilities that a more careful analysis might have revealed. The person most affected by the revelation was Corporal Hunter, whose suspicions had been validated in ways that transformed his understanding of his own observational abilities. Commander Shaw had called him to her office to discuss his role in identifying the inconsistencies in Subject 7 Alpha's behavior. Corporal, your instincts about the prisoner were accurate when trained professionals missed the signs, Shaw said, her voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there during previous conversations. That suggests you have abilities that we should be developing rather than dismissing. Hunter sat at attention, struggling to process praise from officers who'd previously treated his observations as irrelevant speculation. Ma'am, I just noticed things that didn't fit the pattern. Growing up in country teaches you to pay attention to details that might seem unimportant. Those details prevented a significant intelligence failure, Corporal. Captain Thorne's report indicates that your suspicions forced her to be more careful about maintaining her cover, which limited her ability to conduct some aspects of her surveillance operation. Shaw opened a file that contained recommendations flowing from the incident review. I'm recommending you for advanced training in intelligence analysis. Your ability to recognize patterns that others miss could be valuable in roles that require more sophisticated observation skills. The recognition was gratifying, but Hunter found himself troubled by implications that extended beyond his personal advancement. Ma'am, if Captain Thorne could fool everyone else at this facility, how many other prisoners might not be what they appear to be? How do we know when someone is genuinely broken versus when they're just very good at pretending? It was a question that would reshape detention and interrogation protocols across the military intelligence community. The existence of personnel with Captain Thorne's capabilities meant that traditional assumptions about prisoner behavior could no longer be trusted. Meanwhile, in the Secure Communications Center, Admiral Knox was conducting classified conversations with officials in Washington who needed to understand the implications of what had been discovered at Steelwater. The enhanced conditioning protocol exceeded expectations, he reported to a Deputy Secretary of Defense, whose security clearance covered programs that officially didn't exist. Captain Thorne maintained operational effectiveness under conditions that would have incapacitated conventional operatives, and she gathered intelligence that will significantly improve facility security procedures. The success of the operation meant that similar conditioning programs would likely be expanded, creating a new category of personnel whose capabilities would be both an asset and a challenge for the military intelligence community. But the human costs of such programs remained a concern that Knox couldn't ignore. He'd observed Captain Thorne during the debrief, watching for signs of the psychological damage that the enhanced conditioning protocol might have caused. What he'd seen was someone who functioned with remarkable efficiency, but whose emotional responses seemed muted in ways that suggested permanent alterations to her psychological makeup. 3 days after the revelation, Captain Thorne prepared to leave Steelwater for reassignment to another classified operation. Her mission at the facility had been completed, but the intelligence she'd gathered would influence American detention and interrogation procedures for years to come. Dr. Kane conducted a final medical examination, this time with full knowledge of what he was documenting. The results confirmed his suspicions about the permanent nature of the conditioning she'd undergone. "Captain, the physiological changes from your training appear to be irreversible. Your pain responses, stress reactions, and autonomic nervous system functions have been permanently altered. Are you comfortable with the long-term implications?" Thorne considered the question with the same analytical detachment she'd shown throughout her time at the facility. "Dr. Kane, conventional soldiers accept the risk of physical injury or death in service to their country. Personnel who undergo enhanced conditioning protocol accept different risks, psychological and physiological changes that enable operations that conventional personnel couldn't attempt. The trade-offs are understood and accepted." As she prepared to leave, Thorne made a point of speaking individually with each staff member who'd been involved in her case. Her conversations were brief, but carried acknowledgments of their professionalism, despite the impossible circumstances they'd faced. To Corporal Hunter, she offered advice that would shape his military career. "Trust your instincts, but verify your observations. The ability to see what others miss is valuable, but it's only useful if you can convince others to pay attention to what you've discovered." To Agent Frost, she provided perspective on the limitations of conventional interrogation. "Your techniques were sound, but warfare is evolving in ways that make traditional approaches insufficient. The future will require new methods for new kinds of conflicts." To Dr. Kane, she offered insight into the medical implications of her conditioning. The enhanced conditioning protocol represents just the beginning of what might be possible in human performance modification. The ethical and medical questions will only become more complex as the science advances. As Captain Thorne's helicopter lifted off from Steelwater and disappeared into the Colorado sky, she left behind a facility that had been fundamentally changed. By 4 days of interaction with capabilities that redefined the possible, the broken woman in Chamber 9 had been an illusion, but the intelligence she'd gathered and the lessons she'd taught were real enough to reshape how America approached the challenges of modern warfare in the shadows where conventional rules no longer applied. 6 months after Captain Iris Thorne's departure from Steelwater Detention Center, the facility bore little resemblance to the operation that had unknowingly hosted one of the most classified intelligence-gathering missions in modern military history. The changes implemented following her assessment had transformed everything from guard procedures to interrogation protocols, creating a new standard for high-security detention facilities across the country. Commander Shaw stood in the renovated observation center, watching new personnel undergo training that incorporated lessons learned from the Thorne incident. The facility now operated under protocols that assumed prisoners might possess capabilities far beyond conventional expectations. A shift in thinking that had required fundamental changes to how detention and interrogation were conducted. The Enhanced Prisoner Assessment Protocol is now standard at all classified detention facilities, she explained to a visiting inspector from the Pentagon. Every subject receives comprehensive evaluation designed to identify potential military conditioning, specialized training, or unusual physiological capabilities. The inspector reviewed the new procedures with interest. The military intelligence community had been shaken by the discovery that one of their most secure facilities had been thoroughly penetrated by an operative whose true capabilities had gone unrecognized for days. "Commander, what's the success rate for identifying subjects with advanced conditioning?" Shaw pulled up statistics that told a sobering story about how much they'd been missing before Thorne's revelation. "In the 6 months since implementing these protocols, we've identified 12 prisoners who possess training or conditioning that conventional assessment would have missed. None approached Captain Thorne's level of capability, but all required specialized handling that prevented potential intelligence failures. The new protocols had been developed based on Captain Thorne's detailed report about Steelwater's vulnerabilities and the methods she'd used to conduct surveillance while maintaining her cover identity. Her recommendations had been both comprehensive and disturbing, revealing dozens of ways that the facility's security could be compromised by someone with sufficient training and patience. Agent Frost had been reassigned to a position developing new interrogation techniques specifically designed to be effective against personnel with advanced resistance training. Her experience with Captain Thorne had convinced her superiors that traditional approaches needed fundamental revision to address evolving threats. The reality is that warfare has changed in ways that make our conventional training insufficient, she explained to a class of new interrogators at the Military Intelligence School in Maryland. "We can no longer assume that prisoners who appear broken actually are broken, or that resistance techniques we understand represent the limits of what's possible." Her students listened with the focused attention of people learning about capabilities that challenged everything they thought they knew about human psychology and physiology. The enhanced conditioning protocol that produced Captain Thorne's abilities represents just the beginning of what military science might achieve in human performance modification. We have to assume that other nations are developing similar programs, which means we need to be prepared for prisoners whose capabilities exceed anything in our current experience. The broader implications of Thorne's abilities had sparked classified research programs aimed at understanding and potentially replicating the enhanced conditioning protocol. Dr. Kane had been recruited to lead medical research into the physiological aspects of pain immunity training, work that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics while exploring the limits of human adaptation. "The question isn't whether such conditioning is possible," he explained to a review board examining the ethics of experimental military medicine. "Captain Thorne proved that it's not only possible but practical for operational use. The question is whether we can develop similar capabilities while maintaining acceptable standards for human subject research." The research raised profound questions about the prices that military personnel should be expected to pay for enhanced operational effectiveness. Captain Thorne's conditioning had given her remarkable abilities, but it had also changed her in ways that affected every aspect of her human experience. Corporal Hunter, now Sergeant Hunter, had been accepted into the military intelligence program and was developing expertise in recognizing unusual prisoner behavior patterns. His experience with Captain Thorne had launched a career focused on identifying threats that conventional training would miss. "The key is learning to see past surface appearances and trust objective evidence over initial assumptions," he taught new personnel during orientation sessions. Captain Thorne looked like a broken torture victim, but careful observation revealed inconsistencies that indicated something entirely different. His students practiced analysis techniques using case studies drawn from real situations where prisoners had been more than they appeared. The training emphasized that assumptions based on appearance could be not just wrong, but but dangerously wrong in ways that compromise facility security and mission effectiveness. In a secure office in Washington, Admiral Knox reviewed reports from operations conducted by personnel who'd undergone enhanced conditioning protocol training. The success rates were remarkable, but so were the human costs documented in psychological evaluations and medical assessments. "We're creating operatives with capabilities that exceed anything in military history," he reported to officials whose security clearances covered the darkest aspects of American intelligence operations. "But we're also creating people who may never be able to return to normal civilian life." The trade-offs inherent in such programs represented a new category of military service, one that required volunteers to accept permanent changes to their psychological and physiological makeup in exchange for abilities that enabled operations impossible for conventional personnel. 6 months after leaving Steelwater, Captain Thorne was conducting another deep cover operation in a location that officially didn't exist, using skills that officially weren't possible. Her mission reports continued to demonstrate the effectiveness of enhanced conditioning protocol training, but they also revealed the isolation that came with capabilities that separated her from normal human experience. In her personal log, one of the few places where she recorded thoughts that weren't related to operational requirements, she reflected on the costs of the conditioning that had made her so effective. The ability to endure any form of physical or psychological pressure comes at the price of normal emotional responses. Pain immunity requires disconnection from sensations that provide important information about the world. Psychological resistance. Training creates barriers that make genuine human connection nearly impossible. She paused in her writing, considering experiences that most people took for granted, but that had become foreign to her since completing the enhanced conditioning protocol. "I can infiltrate enemy organizations, resist any form of torture, and maintain operational effectiveness under conditions that would destroy conventional operatives. But I can't remember the last time I felt joy, fear, or spontaneous affection. The conditioning that makes me effective also makes me something other than what most people would recognize as fully human." The observation was clinical rather than emotional, another indication of how thoroughly the training had altered her psychological makeup. In Chamber 9 at Steelwater, new prisoners occasionally occupied the cell where Captain Thorne had maintained her cover for 4 days. The facility staff approached each case with enhanced awareness of possibilities that conventional training had never prepared them to consider. The broken woman who had never really existed continued to influence how America approached the challenges of modern warfare, where the lines between friend and enemy, victim and operative, human limitation and enhanced capability had become blurred beyond traditional recognition. Her legacy lived on in protocols that assumed deception, training that prepared for the impossible, and recognition that warfare had evolved in ways that required fundamental changes to how detention, interrogation, and intelligence operations were conducted. The truth about what happened in Chamber 9 would remain classified for decades, but its impact would shape military intelligence operations for generations to come. Because sometimes the most important lessons came from discovering that everything you thought you knew about human capability was just the beginning of what might be possible when necessity demanded the impossible. And in the endless Colorado sky above Steelwater, helicopters continued their flights carrying personnel who might possess capabilities that exceeded imagination, serving in shadows where the price of protection was paid by people whose sacrifices could never be acknowledged or fully understood. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.